Like I said, I am going to share my screen. So as I am getting that set up, I will just also say that when I'm in shared screen, I cannot always see all of your faces. So are you seeing just my PowerPoint slide, my title slide here? Good, okay. So if you have questions when I'm talking, please feel free to just verbalize. If I don't hear you because Zoom does weird things with sound, then the other options that you have would be to use the chat, and that should pop up for me. So you can type into the chat, that's a little button on the bottom of your screen, or you can use the raise hand function. So if you go to the participants button on the bottom of your screen, you'll see the list of everyone who's here, and then you can press raise hand, and that should flash onto my screen as well. So to start, I thought I would just let you know a little bit about me. As John said, in my professional life, I teach at Dickinson. I primarily teach courses on the psychology of gender and sexuality, but I have for the last few years been offering a first-year seminar on the psychology of religion. And as part of that, I've been really interested in what psychologists and neuroscientists have studied about different types of prayer. And part of why this has been interesting to me is because of the variety of prayer experiences that I have had. So I thought I'd also just tell you a little bit about my personal background. So I was born and raised in the Episcopal Church, but it was in a parish within a diocese that used very charismatic forms of prayer along with the rite to liturgy. So, we had the typical Episcopal rite to form, but then we also had praise bands with, guitars and singing and people with their hands raised in the air. So it was this interesting blend of Episcopal and maybe Pentecostal charismatic kinds of worship. I left the church for a good 20 years or so for a lot of reasons. When I returned, I was really drawn back to those liturgical practices that I grew up with, but I was also really drawn to more contemplative styles of prayer. And in addition to attending St. Stephen's for the past few years, I've also been making regular retreats at a teen monastery. I've also been a part of a prayer group at Mount Calvary here in Camp Hill, and been practicing more meditative forms of prayer like centering prayer. So in this talk, I am hoping to tell you about what's happening in the brain and what's happening psychologically when we do these different kinds of prayer. And then after I'm done talking, I will break into having us practice some of these so that there will be an experiential component where we can try them and maybe reflect on how they feel. So last caveat before I get into this is I am not a neuroscientist, right? This is not my primary area of expertise, but I have been reading and talking about some of these issues for a while. So first of all, we have known for decades that religious practices like prayer, like attending organized religious services, are associated with a lot of positive psychological and physical health effects, right? So psychologically, we know that religious practice is associated with lower depression, lower anxiety, lower general stress, and just a greater sense of well-being in a sense that your life has meaning. On the physical side, religious people live longer. They have better cardiovascular health. They have lower blood pressure, lower inflammation in the body, and better immune function. So all of these benefits, these mental health benefits and physical health benefits, they show for people who only attend religious services, but the impact is even greater for people who have a daily prayer practice. So people who are engaging in prayer and meditation on their own more regularly are the ones that have the highest or the greatest boosts in terms of mental health and physical health. So it seems like this private prayer and meditation are really important in some way. So what is happening? What is happening neurologically when we pray or meditate? So I'm going to not use a ton of technical information or technical terminology, but I do want to show you like areas of the brain that are activated. So to first just orient you all as a refresher for some anatomy. This is our brain. This is showing the lobes on the surface, so this is kind of the external view of the brain, we have the frontal lobe that is associated with thinking and planning and attention, problem solving. So this is where our kind of higher intellectual functions tend to happen. The parietal lobe, we're now moving towards kind of like the middle of your head. And just to orient you, this is somebody looking in that direction over here. So moving to the parietal lobe, we're moving backwards towards the back of your head. This processes sensations like temperature, feelings of touch and movement. The temporal lobe below the parietal lobe, so it's down by your temples and above the ear, that is involved in language processing and also auditory sounds, so how we process sounds coming in. It's also the seat of memory and emotion. Mm. And then finally, the occipital lobe, it's back here in the back of your head, that kind of bulge that you have at the top of your spine. This is where visual processing happens. So any visual stimulus coming in gets processed in the back of our heads. Other components we see down here, this gray stripy area, that is the cerebellum, that's involved in balance and coordination. And this is our brainstem, right? That's coming down, that does our life-sustaining activities like keeping up our heart rate, our temperature, and our breathing. So with that brief overview, I'm going to talk about 3 different kinds of prayer or meditative practice and look at the areas of the brain that are really active when we're doing those. So the first is what researchers have called formalized prayer. So this would be when we recite a prayer that we know, usually by heart, so something like the Lord's Prayer. We have this in our memory, we've said it a lot. These are relatively impersonal because they're meant to apply to anybody who's saying it. So they're pretty abstract concepts, right? It's not really about our own individual lives. It's about something that would apply to everyone who's saying it. So this kind of prayer activates these specific regions in the brain. So I'll walk through what they all do. So in this part of the frontal lobe, this is where working memory is kind of housed. So that is activated during these recitations of prayer that we know really well, which makes sense because we have it in our memory. There's areas in the parietal cortex. Again, that's kind of language processing. So this makes sense as well. This area in the cerebellum is where, like I said, it's kind of our sense of movement and balance. So it's not really clear why that is really activated during reciting kinds of prayer. But sometimes some people think that this might be involved in learning. So because the Lord's Prayer or other things that we know by heart are things that we've learned, that might be why this is active. And then this last piece, and I made this dark red because this is actually referring to something deeper within the brain rather than out on the surface. So imagine that dark red means it's deep inside. This area is related to a reward system. It's called the caudate nucleus. And this is the area that kind of teaches us that when we do something, we're likely to get a reward or not. So this also kind of releases dopamine a lot of times when it's activated, and dopamine is a neurotransmitter that provides us with a sense of pleasure and positivity. So psychologically, there's evidence that when people recite well-known prayers, that we have a reduction in anxiety. One research study that did this looked specifically at the rosary. And so repeating the rosary over a 30-minute period, people showed decreases in anxiety. So that may be also kind of what's happening here in this deep emotion area of their brain. So I want you to think about this image and these areas as a baseline to compare the next 2 types of prayer, because they're really, really different. So if this is what's happening when we're just reciting things that we know, let's look at the next kind of prayer, which is what researchers have called personal prayer. So this would be like, you know, your unscripted prayer when you're speaking to God about your own life, about things that are happening for you, about other people that you're concerned about. So these are the direct conversations that are just improvised and where people are praying as if they're talking to someone who they think is listening, right? So just you speaking to God. During this kind of prayer, the activation in the brain looks completely different from the scripted prayer. And here's what's activated here. So there is a different area of the frontal lobe. I'm going to describe what they do all together because they really work together. So there's this different area of the frontal lobe. This is the border between the temporal lobe and the parietal lobe, and then this little tip of the temporal lobe. These three areas are almost always working together and are almost always activated at the same time. And they're specifically activated when we have conversations with other people. So these are the areas that focus on us kind of thinking about our own intentions, thinking about our own memories and our history, analyzing the other person in a conversation, and thinking about reciprocity in relationships. So kind of give and take, back and forth, like happens in a typical conversation. So in personal prayer, then these researchers concluded that when people are engaging in this kind of prayer, where we're just spontaneously talking to God about our problems, our hopes, our requests, that people seem to be activating the same areas of the brain as when they talk to a person in, a face-to-face kind of environment. So the brain functions in the same way as it, when speaking to God in this way, as when we have interpersonal conversations with other people. So this I find really interesting, that I'll just flip back to that previous picture, that some areas are involved, even though it's still language-based, some areas are involved when we're reciting things that we know, and then different areas and conversational areas are involved when we're just having our normal casual kind of prayer. So the third type of prayer that I want to show you is the kind of prayer that we might call meditation and some meditative forms of prayer. So here I'm talking about nonverbal, silent forms of meditation or prayer. And in a lot of cases, people might use different strategies to get into the mindset of the meditative or contemplative or transcendent space. So in the Christian tradition, this is typically called contemplation or centering prayer. In other traditions, it might involve visualization or breathing or yoga, so physical practices. But all of them are similar in that the ultimate goal is to kind of stop doing those things and just rest in silence with God or the divine or the universe or whatever that ultimate sense is. So this research comes from Andrew Newberg, who's written a lot of popular books that I'll give you some references for at the end of the talk. And what he and his colleagues did was they initially took Buddhist monks, Tibetan Buddhist monks, and put them in a scanner when they were engaging in this kind of transcendent meditation. A couple of years later, they got a group of Franciscan nuns and did the same thing, did brain scans while they were engaged, in this case, in a centering prayer practice. And the goals for each of these groups were different, right? So the Buddhists said that they were meditating in order to create a sense of enlightenment, or trying to become enlightened. The Catholic nuns said that they were meditating to create a sense of God's presence and to feel a unity with God, to feel like they were with God. The two groups also differed in that they used different strategies to get to that point of transcendence. So the Buddhist monks were using a visual meditation, and the Catholic nuns, like I said, were using centering prayer, which we'll talk about in a little bit, but it's word-based. So instead of being visually based, it was kind of auditory or word-based. What Newberg was most interested in was the point at which both of these groups stopped doing those active things because they had reached the point where they could just sit in silence and kind of be in the transcendent environment. And so the people in the scanner were instructed to like pull a cord when they got to that point of being at the ultimate peak of their experience. So even though both groups had different methods to get there and they had different goals, their brains looked the same once they were in that transcendent that feeling of transcendence, that being with God or in enlightenment. So here's what's happening. The biggest difference between this kind of event, this kind of experience, and the kind of verbal prayer that we were talking about a moment ago is that there's areas of the brain that show a decrease in their activity. So for both of these groups, blood flow and activity is reduced in the parietal lobe. Now, this area is the area that gives us a sense of how we ourselves are separate from other people. So when blood flow decreases there, there's this greater sense of unity between you and whatever it is you're contemplating. So unity with God or unity with the universe. The parietal lobe is also involved in language processing. So less blood flow here means that the experience isn't really being processed with language. And when we talk to people who have had these kinds of mystical experiences, they will often say things like, oh, I just can't describe what it was like. I have no words for this. And that may be related to this kind of reduced blood flow in that area. Finally, the parietal lobe is also involved in spatial orientation, like kind of knowing where your body is in space. You know, I know that my arm is right next to this table. I know when I'm going to touch it. So less blood flow in this parietal lobe also means that we're just kind of less aware of our physical bodies. And again, when you talk to people who have had these mystical experiences, they will sometimes use words like my body was melting away. I didn't feel myself anymore. So that's one really big difference between this kind of prayer and meditation and the others. Those other verbal prayers don't show reduction in this area. The second finding was higher activity in the frontal lobe during meditation. This gives us an increased feeling of attentiveness and concentration. So that means that these meditators were highly attentive while they were also experiencing this kind of decreased sense of self. So they're concentrating, they're being attentive. It's not like their mind is just going away. They're very focused on what's happening. And then finally, there's increased activity in the temporal lobe. So the temporal lobe includes parts of the hippocampus, which is associated with feeling emotions really intensely, feeling very positive emotions in many cases. And people who are having these mystical experiences talk about them as just blissful, really peaceful senses of oneness with, again, whatever it is that they're meditating on. So all of these three components happening together then create this kind of wordless experience of God or enlightenment that are happening because of, it seems, especially intense activation of the temporal lobe along with these decreases in the parietal lobe. And these are things, again, that verbal prayer just really doesn't do. And just as a final component of this, although Newberg studied visualization with Buddhist monks and centering prayer with Franciscan nuns, other people have continued this research and shown that different Buddhist techniques of breathing and different Hindu techniques of yoga do the same thing, show the same kind of activation and deactivation. So before I shift out of the screen share to see if folks have questions, and before we try these different kinds of prayer and meditation, I just wanted to share some final research on how engaging in prayer and meditation, when people do it regularly, stick with it, that causes changes in the brain that are long-term. It causes psychological changes that are long-term as well. So this is the phenomenon known as neuroplasticity, that we can have experiences that actually change the physical structure of our brains.
Can I ask a question really quickly?
Yes, please.
Before you get to this part,
yeah.
did they, do you have comparison, or do they have comparisons with, just like the slides you showed, with different times of sleeping?
So these studies have all been when people are coming into a lab to engage in this meditation practice for a specific period of time. So like they know they're going to be in a scanner for an hour, they're going to do the meditation and hopefully have that peak experience, and then it would be done.
Yeah. I understand that, but I'm asking about compare this to other studies entirely where they were doing this.
So the one area that I know that this has been compared to a lot is epilepsy. So in temporal lobe epilepsy, when people are having seizures in this area of the brain in particular, that's often associated with really intense spiritual feelings and feeling like there's a presence there. And a lot of people who have temporal lobe epilepsy don't want their seizures to stop because they want to cultivate that feeling of oneness with God or the universe. So that's one comparison. I know EEG studies, so not brain flow studies, but brain wave studies, those are sometimes looked at the point where people are just starting to fall asleep, or the point where you're just waking up, or in dream states. That's because those are done over a longer period of time and people can be going about their daily lives and doing other things, it's harder to narrow in on like exactly what's going on in the brain. But some of those brainwave studies show that in this kind of meditation, well, they show the temporal lobe activity. So even when it's not seizure level, it's still increased activity in the temporal lobes that looks like meditation. And that some people are just kind of prone to having these at random periods, at random times when they don't intend for it to happen. So it seems like some people just have a really active temporal lobe that gives them these feelings of spirituality happening at random times of the day. So I don't know that that's really exactly answering your question, but that's the closest I can do.
Something that ties into that very quickly is, I cannot remember her name. I think the first name is Jill. It's a scientist who had a stroke and wrote a book called My Stroke of Insight.
Yes.
And in that book, she describes, she's able to see herself somehow going through this stroke and able to see herself becoming one with everything. And it's a worthwhile read because she had an experience that is, I think either, I don't think it's truly unique, but truly maybe almost unique in the awareness that she had of what was, this book.
Yes, I haven't read it. It's on my bookshelf to read, but it does sound really fascinating.
To make it even easier, there's a TED Talk. And it's fascinating to hear her describe her experience of, certain parts of her brain are falling away and other parts are lighting up, and she can see this connectiveness to all things. It's pretty wild.
Nice, thanks, Ginny.
That's due to a lack of blood flow between the parietal and the temporal lobes, though. So that's an interesting thing to happen.
Right, and for her to be able to be aware, right, that would probably mean that she still had good functioning in the frontal lobes to be able to be thinking about what was happening to such detail that she could then write about it later.
In great detail.
Yeah, that's really cool. Thank you. So for these long-term changes, this neuroplasticity that we have in our brain that meditation and prayer can induce. So here is what some of this longitudinal long-term research shows. So people who practice meditation or prayer regularly show increased connections in different areas of the brain. So the corpus callosum that runs down the middle that connects both hemispheres of our brain, that can increase in volume from meditation and prayer, as can the small region between the frontal and the temporal lobe. So this is called the anterior cingulate cortex. So these two regions kind of grow with a gain volume from regular prayer and meditation, which suggests that the brain is making new connections, right? It's better able to communicate kind of within itself through prayer and meditation. There's also increases in the size of the hippocampus and other areas that are related to emotion. So people who meditate and pray a lot tend to report having more positive emotions that they get to more easily. They have a greater sense of optimism. They can deal with anger and fear more calmly and have a higher sense of empathy for other people. And this also probably relates to not just changes in brain structure, but also changes in the neurotransmitters. So there are long-term increases in serotonin and dopamine that are associated with less depression and less anxiety. And finally, prayer and And meditation can reduce epinephrine and cortisol. So these are our stress hormones that produce the kind of fight or flight feeling or produce generalized anxiety. And long-term prayer and meditation can reduce the levels of those in our body and our brain. Areas of the frontal lobe can increase that then relate to having a better attention span and better long-term memory. Newberg's study taught people to meditate for 12 minutes a day, and they did this in a period of 8 weeks. And after just 8 weeks of 12 minutes a day, people had objectively measurable better memory and better ability to maintain their attention spans for longer periods of time. And then people who use visualization kinds of meditation, they report that their imagery, their ability to see things in their mind gets much sharper, and they have more vivid images in their mind's eye. Of course, you know, we have people writing for centuries, if not millennia, about the way that engaging in prayer causes changes in their spiritual life. So people have written extensively about the way that their experiences of God and their spiritual experiences change over time as they pray more, as they meditate more. So as people engage in these practices more, they're more likely to feel very close to God and have more intense spiritual experiences that feel more and more real over time. So that was the presentation part. Let me pause and see if there are other questions before we move into doing some of these prayers and meditations together. And then hopefully we'll have a little bit of time at the end to reflect on how those feel for us. Any other questions that didn't come up yet?
Megan, if I can jump in, I'm just curious, in your own prayer life, does what you know about what's going on in your brain when you do it enhance your experience of prayer, or is there a risk even of diminishing it because it takes away some of the mystery we often associate with prayer?
I think that's a really good question. And I don't think it's limited just to brain studies. I think the more, you know, you study about like the history of the church and the way that liturgy developed and what's happening in your brain during prayer, I think all of those things can take away the mystery if you let it. For me, I'm not really thinking about these things when I'm practicing, you know, like I know them, but I think I have kind of compartmentalized in some way. Like, this is an interesting intellectual exercise and I think it's fascinating and I want to learn more about it. But when I'm doing it, like, that's not really what I'm thinking about. And I think there's probably ways to imagine that, you know, just because we can get to the exact point where something is happening in your brain and we can say, okay, this is what is responsible for these feelings of spiritual, you know, enlightenment, like, it can still be God that's doing that. Right? You don't have to, I don't think, remove your belief system once you know these things are what's happening physiologically, if that makes sense. Other questions? Want to just try? So here is what I'm hoping we will do. Hoping you will join me in. So I have put together 2 forms of verbal prayer that we are going to be very familiar with, and 2 forms of meditation or contemplation that all come from the Christian tradition. So I'm going to ask you to participate to the extent that you're comfortable and try to notice how your body feels and how your mind is reacting as you are going through these different kinds of practices. So even though I just said I usually compartmentalize, I'm going to encourage us not to compartmentalize at this moment and really try to observe ourselves as we're doing these. There are 3 total, because the 2 forms of verbal prayer will be kind of together in one, and each takes about 5-6 minutes or so. So I think we'll have time to do all of them and then share at the end. So for the first one, for this kind of verbal prayer, I'm going to start with verbal prayer that involves both formalized components and personal prayer. So this will be very familiar to us Episcopalians. I'm going to lead us through Form 6 of the Prayers of the People from the Book of Common Prayer. And I chose this version because it has a really good mix of formalized prayer where we'll have a call and response, and then multiple spaces for personal prayer. So we'd be able to participate in both of those forms of prayer that I talked about at the beginning of the talk. So while this is happening, if you would like to unmute yourself and have the verbal response with me, you can. That would be great. If you don't want to, that's fine. But I am also going to pause a little bit longer than I think we normally do in a service when there are those pauses for personal prayer. So I'll probably stop for 30 seconds to a full minute so that we can be doing both kinds of verbal prayers during this. Also, if this feels uncomfortable to you to do on Zoom, although at this point we're probably pretty experienced with it, you can feel free to turn off your video camera if that would make it feel a little bit more okay to participate. Questions? Are we good to go? All right. So I've reprinted this with the words that I will say here, just in regular font, and then the bold and italics for your response. In peace, we pray to you, Lord God, for all people in their daily life and work.
For our family, friends,
for those who are alone.
For this community, the nation, and the world.
For all who work for justice, freedom, and peace.
For the just and proper use of your creation.
For the victims of hunger,
injustice,
oppression.
For all who are in danger, sorrow, or any kind of trouble.
For those who minister to the sick and the needy.
For the peace and unity of the Church of God.
For all who proclaim the gospel.
And all who seek the truth.
For all bishops and other ministers.
For all who are God in His church.
For the special needs and concerns of this congregation. Hear us, Lord.
For your mercy. For your mercy is great.
We thank you, Lord, for all the blessings of this life. We will exalt you, O God, our King.
And praise your name forever and ever.
We pray for all who have died, that they may have a place in your eternal kingdom. Lord, let your loving kindness be upon them.
Put their trust in you.
We pray to you also for the forgiveness of our sins. Together, have mercy upon us.
In your compassion, give us our sins,
known and
Things done.
done. And so by your Spirit,
that we may live
and serve you
in
in
life.
to
you.
Glory to your name.
through Jesus.
Christ.
Amen.
Amen.
Okay, thank you.
If I might just share for a moment, I guess it's because of Zoom and how our voices get distorted in so many speeds and concocted. But it takes me back to those college days in charismatic groups where everyone was kind of speaking in a different tongues. And that's kind of what it came off sounding like, because of the way that we didn't hear each other in the sanctuary, the way we normally do, but rather we're kind of each in our own space yet together.
It's true. This is artificial in many ways. We're not usually saying things like this and hearing half a word from Jack and half a word from you, and then everything at a different time period, right? That communal feeling is definitely lost here. The second activity that I'd like us to do is a more meditative. So this is a guided imagery practice. Christian monks have been writing as early as the 5th century about this kind of prayer, but it was really formalized as a spiritual exercise by Ignatius of Loyola, who, as you know, is the founder of the Jesuits, was writing in the 1500s. So Ignatius believed that God would speak to us through our imagination, and that using imagination to think through passages of the Bible would engage our thoughts and our emotions and would just open us up to experiencing God in a different way. So what I have loosely pulled together from a lot of different sources is using the 23rd Psalm. So your task, if you want to participate in this, is to imagine yourself in this story. The goal is to really try to think about you being there as if you were there, so that you can see things and hear things and smell things, or try to engage this imaginative component in all of your senses. I'll read the psalm kind of a verse or so at a time, and I'll have some prompts about things that you could imagine, but I'm going to leave the details up to you, because, you know, your experience of a brook or a stream or a field is going to be different from other people's. So for this to really work, I'd encourage you to sit comfortably with your feet on the ground if you can. Close your eyes if you're okay with that. And again, feel free to turn off your video if it's easier for you to have your eyes closed without knowing that people are watching you on the screen. And I'll just start reading. So you'll hear, again, a verse and then some prompts to help with the visualization, to kind of turn it into a story that's like a movie in your mind. So you can close your eyes, get comfortable, take a deep breath. The Lord is my shepherd. Imagine yourself in a field of green. There's soft grass to lie on. The sun is warm on your face. Can you feel the warmth on your skin and the light being gentle on your eyes? And picture his face, his hair. You feel immediately calm in his presence. I shall not want. Imagine this shepherd smiles right at you, and you can sense that he will take care of you. He knows his way around the land. The way he smiles at you shows how deeply he cares about you. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside the still waters. Imagine the shepherd starts walking in the meadow with lush grass all around. As you follow him and draw closer, you see there's a stream running through the land. Hear the sound of water flowing gently. Feel the breeze on your face. Look up and see the bright white clouds. You both sit down together next to these waters. Feel your body relax down into the ground. He restores my soul. As you sit comfortably with the shepherd, he invites you to talk with him. Hear his voice. You confide in him, and as you talk, you feel yourself relaxing. You feel a weight lift off your shoulders. Imagine the tightness in your shoulders and chest melting away as you feel this shepherd's care for you. He leads me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. The shepherd gets up and walks across the field. Again, you follow him. Picture the way he walks. Feel your legs move as you walk with him. Breathe in the smell of the green grass, the rich earth. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. Imagine the sun setting. You see how dark the sky has become. The shepherd still walks along purposefully, but you feel the wind picking up. You can hear thunder not too far away. Feel the shivers as your body gets cold. There's apprehension about the coming storm. Again, you look at the shepherd and feel those anxieties leave you. You see him guiding you. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup runs over. As you walk further along, you realize you're hungry a moment before the shepherd sits you down at a table. See your favorite foods prepared before you. Smell the aromas of those foods you love to eat. The shepherd blesses the food. Hear his voice as he says a blessing. He blesses you with oil on your forehead. Feel the touch of his hands on your head. Feel the joy and contentment of food that is prepared just for you. Surely goodness and mercy will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. The shepherd stands up and begins walking again, this time along a path. You see at the end of that path a house. Imagine that home. What's the shape of the roof? What are the doors and windows like? Is there a garden out front? Is there a porch? The shepherd strides up to this house and beckons you to join him. Imagine him opening the door and inviting you inside, where there is music and laughter, light and warmth. You walk through the doorway with the shepherd, and immediately you feel right at home. And that's the end of the psalm. So you can take a minute to come back to reality, stretch your body, open your eyes. In many Ignatian practices, the hope is that by the end, you'll extend the concepts from the story to you today and see the way that this story can apply to your daily life and to your circumstances. So let me move to the last practice, and then hopefully again we'll have a few minutes to talk. So the last thing that I wanted us to try is centering prayer, which is also a meditative prayer in that it doesn't use the words the way that we're using them typically in prayer. So this is silent meditation, letting go of all thoughts, stilling the mind into silence with a goal of just sitting in the presence of God and being with God without words. So this, some people point to Matthew 6:6 as a verse to think about for centering prayer. This verse reads, "If you want to pray, enter your inner room, close the door, pray to your Father in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. So here too, monks as early as the 4th century, the Desert Fathers were writing about these kinds of practices. And in the 1500s, there are many, many Carmelite saints and other saints who wrote about their own silent practices. So St. John of the Cross, St. Teresa of Avila are 2 examples. This form of prayer then became more common in the 1970s when Thomas Keating wrote several books about this. So Keating was a Trappist monk. He was the abbot of St. Joseph's Abbey in Massachusetts, and he was really influenced by Eastern religious practices like those that were found in Buddhist monasteries. But he wanted to show people that Christianity has also always had a contemplative silent prayer side as well, and that we could all use these kinds of practices within our own tradition. So I know some of you are familiar with this practice. For people who aren't, again, this idea is to rest silently in the presence of God. This is harder to do than it sounds. So the practice will be to sit, again, with your eyes closed if you're comfortable. And the feeling is that you're trying to just open your heart and mind to God and be open to the presence of God. An attempt to have this real inner silence of just a calm, quiet mind. Because that is so hard to do, our mind likes to be active, it likes to think about lots of things. When you notice that your mind is wandering or you're thinking about other things, or even if you're praying in words, the goal is to try to just calmly, quietly stop that by using a word. So gently repeat a word which is going to stand as a reminder to yourself that right now is not the time for words, it's just a time to sit and be. So the word you use doesn't really matter because it's not about the content of the word, it's just that word is a symbol to you of your intention to be in this quiet space. So if you don't already have a word from your own practice, you should choose one now. It seems like a lot of people use God-based language. So I gave some examples here. Some people like words that are more kind of about a state of being, like peace or love or holy. Anything you want to use that you think will help remind you that now is a time to just be with God is a good word. So I will open this up with a chime, and then I'm setting a timer for 5 minutes. Typically, people get to the point of 20 minutes at a time. That's the recommendation of the time that contemplative or centering prayer is really strong. And by the point that you'll really get to feeling, if you're lucky, sometimes that you really are in the presence of God. But starting out, 5 minutes is good, 10 minutes is good, getting up to 20 minutes is good. And, the amount of time that your mind wanders is just going to vary. Sometimes people never use their word in their entire practice. Sometimes they're using it every 10 seconds, every 30 seconds. And what Keating has recommended is that you just think that all of those times are just new opportunities to turn back to God. And so it's not good or bad if your mind wanders a lot or a little. It's all just the opportunity to again and again return to being with God. So when this chime rings, you might have a period of time when you really do feel still, and then your mind starts wandering. And so you will say, peace, peace. And hopefully that will give you another period of time when your mind stays still until your mind wanders again. And then you'll say peace, peace. And then, we will repeat that cycle for this 5-minute period. Everyone good with this? Okay, so chime, 5 minutes of silence, and then there will be a double chime to let us know that we are done. So again, please get comfortable, close your eyes, take a deep breath, and then we'll begin.
Those are my shirts, aren't they? God. Oh, those are your nephews. I'm sorry.
Okay, so that was 5 minutes. I see that I have gone right up until 10 o'clock. So John, you can tell us if we have time for people to share reactions or thoughts about this.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's hear from all of us to see what we had to say about this wonderful presentation.
Thanks.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank you for a presentation that was unusually rich in information and experience. Thank you very much.
Sure, thank you. Thank you. Are there different types of prayer that you all find more authentic and that you know are the things that you rely on? Maybe things that I talked about today or others?
Your reflection on the rosary struck a chord with me. Now I understand it on that level. Why they do it at wakes, why it's very calming. It is a meditative thing. You meditate on the mysteries. Going through each one.
I'm always fascinated by the distinct differences in different kinds of prayers. When I do Lectio Divina, at the one phrase that will lift up for me to open up and carry around for the day. And then what you did with this walk in the 23rd Psalm gave me images and experiences that I have never had with it before and really look forward to sitting with. Again, I was always with more than one shepherd. There were always at least 2. They were close by. They were, I won't go into it here, there isn't time, but I would love to unpack it with anybody that wants to at a later time and as a little breakout group. And then during contemplative prayer, one of the things I was reminded of was, I know the way I do it, and that helps me, is that I kind of look at the inside of my eyelids, which means that there's nothing there, but it gives me nothingness to focus on, and it's very, very, very helpful. And again, when that, you know, when a little wild thought wants to come floating by, I gently just take it, put it to the side, and say, yeah, we'll talk about that later on if you want. But thank you so much for all those reminders, and with the energy of doing it in a group, which is very, very precious.
Yes. Thanks, Ginny.
Maybe a final question or comment. I want to be respectful of our time. Okay.
Yes, I've practiced various prayer forms in my life, you know, both, you know, as charismatic, as a Franciscan, etc. But at the same time, I think that finding that inner peace and centering myself to hear those words, that this is to me what centering prayer is about. It's hearing that language that I don't know the words to yet. And yet words might be revealed to me during that form of prayer that I've used. So thank you for sharing.
Well, thank you.
I'm going to sign you off so I can get on my other computer for the next service.
Thank you.
Again, join me in thanking Megan for such a terrific presentation.
Thanks, everyone. So glad you all could be here.
Very well done.
Thank you.
Then just a heads up that next week, Ro Weber and Harry Weber are going to be talking about issues that I know Megan is interested in, especially interested in, which is about gender and gender fluidity in our faith tradition. So do come back for that next week, 9 o'clock, same time and same place. Have a wonderful weekend.
Hi, everyone. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.